Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And we are at episode 61. And this one is called the Blacklist Show.
60 wonderful.
60 wonderful.
Yeah, I had to wait my whole life to be able to say that. Now, of course, I'm 62. I have to come up with some other.
Yes, we are both 62. So where are you today?
I don't know. I think outside of Madison, Wisconsin, I believe. I could be wrong.
Still on tour with Buñuel.
Yeah.
You came up with the Blacklist idea. So tell me, what was it that appealed to you about that idea?
Well, because I've been running into some friends who on this tour who have been blacklisted. And listen, I'm a fan of, as is well known, of any conspiracy that wanders my way. But the greatest part about blacklisting is that unless you actually find that list, you can't quite be sure. But you know, what happens is if you're in that position, you start to talk to others and find out, oh, the same thing happened to you, the same thing. And you start to build patterns. And from patterns, I mean, you know, they've convicted people on circumstantial evidence. So from patterns, you get to see one, I guess if you're a boss, you know, how not, I mean, there are legal ramifications in Silicon Valley. If you call a reference, if you call somebody's workplace for a reference, most companies will say, this is when the person started working. This is when they stopped working. We got nothing because they've been sued before. But blacklisting, I thought, was a curious thing. And it's happening whether we look high, you know, in terms of, you know, Elon Musk and his relationship with the president, or we look, you know, lower. A friend of mine who's a steel worker in New Jersey, a rare field for a woman to be in, but, you know, consistently has found recently that the biggest, and this is, I'm not talking about steelwork like on ships. I'm talking about for Tiffany's and for high-end, you know, hardware on dressers and home furnishings. The biggest guy in the field has somehow now put the word out that she is, you know, a no-fly zone. So it's an interesting maybe form of gaslighting, because the blacklister counts on the fact that you will not figure it out, and you are, you know, bedeviled by this idea that, you know, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm the crazy one here. So it's a pretty interesting field of study, I found.
So by blacklist, just so that we're all on the same page, what we mean is a formal or informal list of who is not to be hired, employed, contracted. So it may or may not be an actual list, but it's a person in power saying this other person is not to be, you can't work with them anymore. That's what we mean by blacklist, right?
Yeah, and if it's done effectively, like I said, you have no idea. You can't prove it. So you're out there sounding like a crazy person. But and you know, and I feel to a certain degree, you know, I can anecdotally bring up instances in which I feel that I have been blacklisted. Of course, this is it's ripe for comedic because I remember it must have been in Living Color where one of the Wayans brothers go, why does it have to be blacklisting? Why can't we call it whitelisting? You know, so it's always funny for me to use the word, but yeah, it's weird. I'll give you my prime example. It involves one of the companies in which I hold a good deal of stock, Apple. I remember at one point, this is after I'd left, because when I was there, I was under Steve Jobs, but Tim Cook was like, you know, we endeavor to hear the truth about, you know, we want our people to, and, you know, I wrote him an email that I thought Steve Jobs himself had personally requested that I not leave to go to Adobe. He sent me an email. And CC'd HR, really like you say, made a counter offer, which was not as high as a 48% salary increase that Adobe had. And I said, well, look, I got to go. 48%. Some people don't even make that a year. I'm sorry, I got to go. Subsequently, you know, I found jobs at Apple that I liked and kind of applied for them. And I started to get a weird feeling that as a result of having turned Steve down, that I would not be entertained at all for future employment. And so I wrote Tim Cook about it. I go, it's ridiculous. And Since then, of course, it's been, and I haven't sought employment at Apple for quite a while. Since then, it's been, I have no way of proving that the guy who's the head of a like $1 trillion corporation has said, Eugene S. Robinson, no go. But given the fact that I've had worked there and gotten one single interview in the last 25 years for a position, I thought, well, it's great. I could do this really well, and I'd be helping them out. It's sort of strange to me. No proof, but that's what it feels like. So,
but how do you tell? And I think that's what you're getting at, is that how do you know if that is not just racism, sexism, whatever? How do you know it's not that more systemic issue?
Well, you don't, and that's the genius of it. However, the steelworker friend of mine actually had somebody. It's a small enough community of people who do. If you have a multi-million-dollar condo, you're not going to Home Depot to get your work done. You go to the people that she goes to, and somebody pulled her aside and said, "Listen, the big kahuna in this industry, I think a company called Farrar, said this is what they said." So she had proof. I mean, the person wasn't gonna publicly attest to this, but came to her unbidden and said, "This is the deal. This is what we heard from so and so." So, in the rare case of candor, you have no way of knowing until you start to talk to other people. Said, "Oh yeah, this guy typically has had problems with women," or the company that had given me a key card said, "You start work on Monday." And then I met the CEO on Friday, and by Monday, the position had been eliminated. And the woman who was my champion there, I believe she was LGBTQ of some form or another, actually called me afterward and said, "Yeah, the position has been eliminated." I think we met actually for lunch. So I'm going to be in the area. I can stop by. I'll meet you. And through nods and gestures, she indicated that things had fallen apart after I met the CEO, who was not interested in having an African-American work there. And I was not going to sue. Why would I want to sue to work in a place, startup, where they weren't interested in having me there? So there have been two instances in which, in stunning moments of candor, somebody has said, "Yeah, you're not crazy. This is really what's going on." So, and very public cases, like with Musk and Trump, or indeed, this is Trump's field of play. You don't have to know, right? Everybody knows who's in favor with Trump and who's out of favor, and that's why these systems kind of creep along unhealthy.
But what can your steelworker friend do? I mean, putting aside legal remedies, which would be something that a lawyer would be able to advise her on, what could she do just practically?
I advised her to employ things that I have employed. Your name, my full name is Eugene S. Robinson. Maybe I send in a resume from E.S. Robinson. Maybe I send a resume in from E. Stanley Robinson. Anything to kind of create the slight veil of confusion. This was the only thing I could recommend, because it seems to me that that might be enough. That might be enough, and especially when I have a very common last name like Robinson, it might be enough to at least get you in the door, which is what you want to succeed or fail on your own merits, not because somebody said something, right? So,
well, are there ever circumstances?
And then there's another way, blacklisting, ideally, would serve a good purpose. If you have somebody who is a total lunatic who you don't want working for you. I mean, I've been in a situation where somebody called and said, "What do you think about such and such as an employee?" And it was a writer I had who had dawned on me very quickly. All of their clips were works. That's a word that they used to use in the fake pro wrestling days. Works meaning something that was kayfabe, which was something that was made up. She had strong editors, and the editors were like taking the work and just kind of like these are people who graduate from high school and can't read. And so then I said, I can't continue this. She was fired, and she start a new job. They called me for a reference, and I go, I'm in a quandary here. I can't keep doing what everybody else is doing by kicking this thing down the road. But her skill set is not strong for the job that she's applied for. But is it my business? And I think I tried to tell the truth as close as possible without unduly affecting her possibility of future employment. I said she was really good organizationally, but not so strong in the writing. That was it. That's as much as I could do. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you didn't interrupt. When I was thinking about this topic in preparation for this, I was thinking about a circumstance where there was a director that I had worked with, and he had inappropriate behavior to a woman. And I saw this, I had witnessed it with my own eyes. And I subtly communicated to a couple of people, a couple of other women in this area, that he was not to be hired. And like that they should be aware of this. And they actually, in this conversation, they were aware of it. They had heard that. And this was kind of in the Me Too time, and when people would talk about a whisper network. And I felt okay about that. Right. I mean, I felt like I have seen this man have this kind of behavior. I know it to be true. I want to make sure that other women who are simply are not exposed to this kind of behavior. Now, it didn't in any way impact his career. He continues to work. He is certainly not blacklisted. But that's, I think, where the interesting part is to me. Where is it appropriate to say this person is you don't want to work with this person, right? I mean, there's certainly are going to be circumstances. And again, putting aside the legality of what you can and cannot say, as you've said, especially between people who know one another, there can be the careful pause. But I do think that there's some things like any kind of sexual assault, sexual harassment that is real, like that, we have seen, we know to be true, and embezzlement. Certainly, I think anyone who is using their position of power as a grift to gain, more power or money or influence or, sexual favors or whatever. I do think that there are certain things that are so egregious that we owe it to our peers, colleagues, the world in general to say this person shouldn't be hired. What do you think?
Yeah, those are cases in which it's pretty clear cut. Like I think I was ranting at somebody the other day. I said, we are not the Catholic Church. I'm not going to take somebody who's got a problem. This was in relationships with something you're familiar with. Take somebody who's got a problem and take them from city to city to city to export the problem. And that's not my job. But, I made a joke about whitelisting, but I have, I'll give you an interesting example. And you have to let me get to the end of it before. So I'm at Ozzy Media, a place we both were, the benighted Ozzy Media, and we are hiring for a CFO, which, as we know now, is probably a pretty important position given the financial grift that the company was involved with. And I'm sitting at my desk and I'm watching convicted felon CEO Carlos Watson bring in a succession of people to interview for the job. I know he's interviewing for the job for CFO, major job. And at one point he called me in his office. He had wanted me to meet somebody, and then the person left. And he said, "So what do you think?" And I didn't want to say anything, but he said, I value candor. I said, "Why are you interviewing so many people who would never hire us?" I didn't say, "Why are you interviewing so many white men for the job?" But it was pretty clear that's exactly what I meant. And I said, your objective here is to hire the best person for the job. But out of all the people who could say that, the one who has to dig deeper, push harder and further, it should be us. To hear, well, there are not a lot of qualified Black candidates. We can't say that. Well, we didn't really find any. We can't say that. We've got to dig deeper and harder, just for our peace of mind. And so he did so. And in fact, we had three CFOs. One was the white guy, great guy, of course, left pretty soon because he wouldn't play along. And then you had two super competent women, one of which couldn't play along and wrote a letter that became part of the court trial, which what you think is an acceptable risk is a felony. I got to go. So these were people of great skill, great talent, and conscience, ultimately. But I'm sure if I were to tell my MAGA friends what I had done, they would be disappointed. They would say, "You are more racist than I am because you saw race in this instance." And I said, "Well, what I saw is 30 years in Silicon Valley when I walk in the door, and I can tell they're not going to give me the job because it was me who walked through the door. It's not paranoia. It's not part of the conspiracy. It's just how people work." So, yeah.
And you're also talking about a moral, ethical, intentional framework. I mean, part of what made Ozzy appealing was that it was a very diverse group of people who were making news for a diverse group of people who were writing articles and creating content. And I think that's part of what's happening in this idea of like blacklisting is we're setting up moral and ethical guidelines and saying if people step outside of these moral and ethical guidelines, there's a consequence for that, right? Like, so the example that I have is when, my son was injured in a car accident. He was in a coma. It was very challenging. I was fighting with United Healthcare to get access to, insurance, all of these things, which I've talked about before. I was working for a company. I needed to keep the job because that's how my insurance came from. And there was a woman who was my supervisor who I thought would be an ally because she was also a single mom and I was a single mom. And she treated me very badly for an extended period of time. I mean, just like terribly. And years later, this is after my son had died. It was all behind me. I was working in an ad agency, and it's hard to get hired in advertising as an older woman. It always has been. And there was a very senior position, great position at a great company where I was working, and she applied for it. Mm-hmm. And my boss, who was the president of the company, said, "You used to work with so-and-so. She sent in a resume. Should I bring her in for an interview?" And I just did this. Pause. And I just said, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he didn't bring her in for an interview. And I don't know what her career path did, but there really was a sense of like someone who behaved so egregiously with such a disregard for human decency to me. That's something that doesn't change. And I think that brings up the idea for me is, can people change? There's been a lot of very high profile men, most of them white, who have had bad behavior and been called out for it. Again, Me Too, but there's other instances that aren't necessarily sexual harassment, but just anger. Do we believe them when they say they have reformed? And do we think they should be given a second chance?
There's a guy who I know, and I've tended to collect really kind of reprobate characters. This guy had terrorized everybody. He had risen as used to be the British Secretary of Defense. So he's like massive, but he and I kind of in a small way for a short period of time worked for him in publishing. He was in publishing and UK publishing, and well known. A board of directors had to finally pull him aside and said, "Listen, you gotta stop." Anger, of course, was his issue. They got him executive counselor. They made him take classes. So instead of throwing things at people and screaming, he had a whole kind of protocol for what he was supposed to do when he got really angry. But it's still, people knew his reputation preceded him, were scared to death. So his thing was, go stand up out of your chair, go to the window and look out the window until you relax. But of course, there are many ways you can stand up from a chair. And so the way he stood up from a chair radiated all this anger and people were terrified. But, in a weird way, he was always nice to me. And it was a combination of a couple of things. One, I was an A-list performer, but two, I thought there was something sort of weirdly charming about this performative anger thing that he was doing, right? So I never had the occasion to be on the receiving end of it because I wasn't screwing up. But it seemed to me, like we mentioned on the show, the last show, about my friend Todd, who they would pile the work on and he would flip. It seemed to be a performance, but a performance in which he was he was wrapped up in it. I guarantee you the people who worked for him did not enjoy working for him at all. But I could see that, one, there was sort of a method to his madness, and the efforts at remediation he took seriously. He went to the classes. He studied with the counselor. He wanted to be better. Now, I've lost track of him. I haven't talked to him in the last 5 years. I periodically ask our friends in common how he's doing, and it seems to me that he is making a combination of things. He's got had a very young daughter, who I imagine maybe is now probably 18. And he did not want to be this way at home. And he had like a third or fourth wife that he very desperately did not want to get divorced from. So, I would like to think that you can get better. I think a deeper question is, do you forgive the sin? How soon do you forgive the sins of the past? Right. And what happened with you happened to me. I've talked about this former boss manager I had who slammed a phone book down on my keyboard, which on top of my hands, and said, "Do it now," this kind of thing. And then later sent in, after the company folded, sent in a resume to a place where I was in a position to affect her future employment. And I did what I like to call the Sicilian method, which I was like, "Oh, I lost your resume. Could you send it in again?" And she would send it in again. Yeah, you got where I'm going. Just dragged it out. And eventually she figured out he's not going to help me. And I left it to her to figure out exactly why it was. And this is not good business policy. I shouldn't have done this. I'm admittedly, but it is Machiavellian in this instance. When you make enemies in the business world, when you make professional enemies, they will be your enemies forever. The only benefit is that they forget you forget their name, or they forget your name. Whoever is, misstepped, that they forget the passage of time. It helps you. No other way to get around it.
And I am very attached to the redemption story arc. I mean, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I know lots of other recovering alcoholics and drug addicts, and I have seen people completely turn their lives around and live in a very different way. But I do think it takes time and intention and some sort of action. But what was interesting is, I was thinking about this. So Scott Rudin, he was the producer of The Social Network, No Country for Old Men, very famous. There was a recent article in the New York Times that he had been ostracized for bullying. Yep. So I read the New York Times article, and he admitted that he had an anger problem. He said, quote, "I was just too rough on people," unquote. And then he said, his idea was, "I'm all better now." He says he got, quote, "a decent amount of therapy," unquote, and spent a lot of time reading some books. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm buying that. And then I went back to look at what he actually did. So here's an article from the Hollywood Reporter from April 2021. This is a quote. "At about 4:15 p.m., more than 10 hours into a typical Rudin day that began at 6 and never wrapped before 8, the Oscar-winning producer was enraged that one of his assistants failed to get him a seat on a sold-out flight. In a fit of fury, he allegedly smashed an Apple computer monitor on the assistant's hand. The screen shattered, leaving the young man bleeding and in need of immediate medical attention," unquote. And I was like, you know what? That takes a completely different flavor. That's not yelling. That's not getting up precipitously from a chair. That's assault and battery. I mean, that is like, that's pretty significant. And that idea of like, who gets to come back. And then also the notion of there are some people, as we know, that are living on the public stage in a way that they're operating with complete impunity. Right? I mean, we all saw Jeff Bezos's very expensive wedding and, all of the things that went with that. I guess he spent like $50 million on his wedding. And, I was looking at an article from this last December out of the Nation, and it says, quote, Amazon's data. They looked through Amazon data and found that Amazon warehouses recorded over 30% more injuries than the warehousing industry average in 2023. The committee also found that in each of the past 7 years, Amazon workers were nearly twice as likely to be injured as other workers in other warehouses. So this is someone who, aside from the fact that he's, paying 1.1% in taxes to my, 30, 40, 50 something as a self-employed person,
Right.
there's also the idea of like, he suffers no repercussions for that.
Yeah.
So there are people on the public stage. I mean, you may say Elon Musk may be blacklisted from working for the Trump administration, but it hasn't impacted his financial well-being in any way.
That's true. That's true. And the thing that also, when you mentioned Hollywood and you mentioned Rudin, I'm thinking of an instance in which blacklisting kind of works. It works in a way that is helpful. Right. And a friend of mine worked for a producer in Hollywood. That's what we're talking about. And the guy wasn't like a Rudin, smashing hands and so forth. But this producer would show up at 11, take an hour lunch, and then jet out of the office at 3 for yoga. Right. This was like every day, 5 days out of the week, this would happen. So that producer apparently was fairly effective in their job and got a massive raise, like $200,000, $300,000 raise. And so my long-suffering producer's assistant, said, like, maybe I sat down with the figures, maybe I could get $1 more I just figured it out and the guy sat back from his desk and said, we really don't want to go throwing money around here, and denied the request for a raise. But this was like wildfire through this assistant community. You get a good assistant in Hollywood, and this person can be with you for 40 years. A person can buy a house in Hollywood if you can actually stick it out for that long. But at this point, it was like this guy was, again, no fly zone. And so when his show ended and he moved on to somewhere else, and she had gotten another producer, another job, another gig with somebody who was a little bit more generous. That guy had a hell of a time finding people to work for him. He wasn't throwing things, didn't have an anger management problem. However, that kind of, generosity begets generosity, and he was denied it at least.
And that might be a good metric, right? Is that it said in this article, I don't know the exact numbers, but Rudin had over 100 assistants in like a 5-year period.
Yeah. And
that's a sign, right? If nobody will work for you, especially in that assistant level, then maybe that's a sign. So we're just about done. Any last thoughts?
I guess if you maintain a blacklist, but don't be on a blacklist. Those are my last thoughts, because you can't let people, get ahead who are bad people, but also, you can't get on the bad side of bad people either. So,
and I think also what I would suggest is be very intentional about the impression that you leave with people. Right. So, I mean, I've been in this career in this town for many, many years, and people that used to be the assistant, that were the receptionist, that were the junior account person, are now running accounts and running companies, and they hire me because I was nice to them then. Right. So be mindful that people have long memories, and being kind and thoughtful and, doing considerate things for someone is a good thing in general. But it's always, there is business karma is real.
Especially as I get older, I realize there's a lot of stuff I've forgotten. So you got to remember. Like some guy said to me the other day, "Hey, remember what you told me when I showed you my poetry?" And I was like, "Oh no." And I didn't remember at all, but he remembered. So anyway.
Yeah, that's good. All right, if you have a thought, a comment, a suggestion for a future show topic, WTF at badbossbrief.com, WTF at badbossbrief.com, and we will see you in a couple weeks. Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, worst case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.